Heavenly Father, oh, there we go. My Lord in heaven, I thank you so much for this here Sabbath day. I thank you for how you've led us all, how you're leading this movement. I ask that you send your Holy Spirit here to be with each of us, to open our mind, to help us see the things that you want us to see, to help us to understand those things you want us to understand, that we need to understand to go through this period of time, and to give a message to the church and then to the Levites, or to the Nethinims, to the world. I pray this in Jesus' name, amen. So good morning and happy, well, I guess it's not morning for everyone, but it certainly is for me, and happy Sabbath. To begin, I just wanted to sort of tell you a little bit about what's been going on. And I think you can see God's guidance and providence in what's going on in some respects. So this quarter, we are studying in the church. This is the quarterly. It's on Genesis. And so I teach in the Sabbath school there. And the first lesson that I had to teach in the quarterly was the fall. And I got to, it talked about in the quarterly about the serpent. So I got to express the idea and teach the idea of freedom and equality, and to show how Satan had perverted this idea of freedom. And I went through a lot of patriarchs and prophets to show just how what Satan, his character is like, what he was saying about the government of God. And then I got to, because it was on the fall, I got to talk about Eve and the fall and rulership of man over woman. And it wasn't well received. I had people come up to me and say, the odd person said, well done, but there's definitely resistance. They, what bee is in your bonnet is sort of a comment, and you sort of need to not come so sort of face on, but a gentler approach would be better. And so that was very interesting. It's a little disheartening to express this message to the church and to have it not well received. So the next, last week was my next presentation, and this was all the nations and Babel. And what was the very first study on Sunday was they called it the curse of Ham, but the curse of Canaan, and Genesis 14. And so I was able to do Kathy McGraw's study on this to show about how this was what kind of an act this really was, that it was maternal incest. And I went through the study with them, and I then got to talk about how the patriarchal system was the platform or model for the enslavement of women was the model or platform for the enslavement of man. And that's where this ties together. And I had an elder stand up during my presentation, and basically he said that, Adam was created first, and that gives him he's first, that makes him the dominant, and he also he was given dominion over the all the animals, and he named them, and he also named Eve, so that gave him dominion over women, over woman, or over Eve. So again, not really very well received by the people, and I found it quite disheartening. You know, I can come here and speak to, you know, I guess I'm speaking to the choir in some respect. You all are familiar with the message, believe in the message, and you're encouraging of one another in this message. But the church is another story, and when you speak to them about it, it's quite disheartening. It leaves you, when you leave. When I left the church, I felt so low and disheartened about the whole thing, just because of you know, the unacceptance of any of this. And it's hard, it really is, to see, you know, your friends and people, they just are blind to this whole issue. And I know that it's, you know, in some ways we're going to be raised up in some way, and this whole thing will come to them. But it's a difficult battle. And I know when we teach here, and I know I've had experience teaching subjects that aren't anything to do with this message, and it's a lot easier, and it's easy to teach things that people accept, but when they're not accepting it, it can be hard. So I just wanted to express that point of view. And I don't know, has anyone else experienced this sort of thing when they've tried to share the message with others? Any thoughts or suggestions?
Marie, one-on-one, not so much in a Seventh-day Adventist Sabbath school class.
Yeah, I know.
there have been some, you know, you can just almost see people either rising up or just drawing back. You know, they just sort of not literally step back from you, but there is a response. And Ali has a comment in the chat as well.
Yeah, okay. So in past, when you're sharing the 2520 with people, that you experience the similar aspect. So I'll get into, I just wanted to share that, just to give you something about what's been going on, what I've been experiencing. And in a way, that's kind of what I'm sharing today also. I'm looking at what I originally thought it was going to be, was a look at what is an image, but it's more I would say, what is the nature of the Sunday law. I know that we've been, if you've been watching the Vespers and the camp meetings, you know that there's sort of been this, I call it a new development. So I've had a lot of different things floating around in my mind, and I've been making some connections, seeing how some of these things fit together. So that's what I'm going to share today, some of these things that but there's some of these things that I'm not exactly sure how they fit together. So I'm going to ask for your help, and hopefully we can see how they're connected and how some of them fit. So I want to say that I was extremely excited when I heard Elder Tess present on the freedom and equality. And it excited me because I saw this as a tool. It was a tool that it can be used to get you onto the right side of the issues. Now, I kind of understood the gender equality and how it fit with the Eden to Eden model, but it is sometimes hard to see um, how it works in your personal life, and some of the issues that you face, and to see the right way to go. And it's sometimes hard to apply the principles of equity. At least I find it in my life. I'm not always sure I'm on the right side. And I'll give you some examples. So for an example, wearing a mask. I could see the other side of the argument. I had discussions with people at work and other people, and I could see this, the other side, that people, should maybe have freedom to not wear a mask if they wanted to. But now I'm armed with this new tech, this idea of freedom and equality. And I can really see now that people not wearing a mask are putting their freedom over others' equal rights not to be exposed to the virus. So I found this very powerful and exciting, this whole idea of freedom and equality, and just as a tool to help me personally to get onto the right side of the issues. And I started thinking about how in our lives, how government, we've been talking about big government, how government has an impact. And just in some of the things, for example, if you wanted to cut down trees on your property, you have to get a permit. The government says what trees you can cut, cannot cut down. And you think, I own this property. I own it in fee simple. It's mine. I should have the right to decide what trees I want growing and if I want to cut down a tree. And why is this government trying to impose what trees I can cut down? And I just want my freedom to have whatever trees I want. And then also in Vancouver, we see they're going to, or have stopped the use of one-use cups, for example, that sort of single-use cups. And they want us to move to, a glass container, plastic containers that we can take the drink away from, say, coffee, for example. And we see this is again, government interfering. Shouldn't I be free to have my coffee in any kind of cup that I choose? And when we see now that we have this tool, we can say, yeah, what the government is trying to do is to protect the environment so that the future generations will have a good environment, the same environment or a better environment than we have, that we don't destroy our environment, and that idea. And it fits with with God's idea. It's not our planet. We are stewards of the planet. We should be taking care of the planet. And so this is it is an object of freedom, putting freedom to have whatever cup you want or cut whatever tree you want, over the equality of everybody having access to a good, clean environment. So I can see now a lot clearer to be with this tool, to be on the right side of these issues that sometimes, where is the balance between freedom and equality? So I found that was very exciting when I started to see her presentations on this. And so I've been thinking a lot about this freedom and equality. And but I've also been thinking about something that Elder Parminder said at the last camp meeting. At least I believe it was the last camp meeting. And it was one very short sentence. It wasn't even related to the topic that he was discussing. It was completely off topic. And sorry about that. We're getting a call on my iPad, my wife. He said something to the effect, we know there is not going to be a Sunday law, about Sunday. And then he said, there's not even going to be a law. And I said, what? Wait, what? There's not even going to be a law? And so I've been thinking a lot about this idea. This was just one comment he made. And so I've been thinking about it. So I want to ask a question of all of you. And I want to say, why do Adventists think there's going to be a law?
Because the great controversy tells them.
Right. And we also have this idea that, at least I think, that this idea of speaking like a dragon, that the lamb-like beast speaks like a dragon, that this speaking is that a country speaks through its laws. This is also from the Great Controversy, this idea that a country will speak through the laws that it makes. And so we see this, for me, this connected to the image of the beast, the changing of the lamb-like beast to a dragon-like beast, that it starts to speak like a dragon. So this is where my mind went when I heard that there wasn't going to be a law. I said, well, if there's not going to be a law, then what's it going to look like where for the lamb-like beast to speak like a dragon?
The other thought that came to my mind was the word decree.
Mm-hmm.
Whether in Daniel or elsewhere in scripture. And you're right, that decree, speaking like a dragon, being the legislative branch, laws being
Yes.
enacted and so on.
That's what I remember in the movement, them talking about, is that we shouldn't be looking at the president for this law, that we need to look at the legislature, the Republicans that are in power, for example, because that's where this law is going to originate, in the legislature, not because the president doesn't make laws. So this struck me that there's not going to be a law. Okay, well, I got to change my thinking. What's going on here? So I want to try and define lamb-like beast. And I want to say that the idea of a beast, and correct me if I'm wrong, or if you have a different opinion, is a beast is a world-dominating empire. And I want to say lamb-like, it means that it has the image, and I'll say, of God's kingdom, that it's a lamb-like beast is a world-dominating empire that has a government or it has an image of God's kingdom. This is the way I sort of think of what a lamb-like beast is, this idea. And we know that the United States is this lamb-like beast. And so I want to ask a question about how is the United States, if thinking back or thinking as the United States as a lamb-like beast, what is it that makes it similar or has the image of God's kingdom? What are some of the aspects that make it similar to God's kingdom? Because it's a lamb-like, it represents or reflects Christ or his character. So this world-dominating empire, lamb-like beast, should reflect God's character, Christ's character in what it looks like. So I want to sort of look a little bit at that. So So we're going to look at what God's kingdom looks like. And we know that it's not like Satan's kingdom. For example, the king of the north, a king and a kingdom, the king of the north rules over the people. and the people serve the king. This is what we understand of Satan's kingdom. And we know that God's kingdom is not like that. And so I want to take us to Patriarchs and Prophets, page 36. And let me just see if I can do this screen share again. Okay, that's not working. Well, it's not a short quote, so I'll just say it's on page 36 of Patriarchs and Prophets. And it says, "The King of the universe summoned the heavenly hosts before him, that in their presence he might set forth the true position of his Son and show the relation he sustained to all created beings. The Son of God shared the Father's throne and the glory of the eternal, self-existent one encircled both." So we see, yes, thank you, Jonathan. That's in the comment or in the chat. Jonathan posted it. So what I want us to see is, or ask, why did God need to make this statement before all the angels to exactly who Christ was? Who did they think he was? Or what did they think he was? Any ideas, any suggestions? Yeah, right there. So who did or what did the angels think Jesus was?
They thought he was an angel like them.
Right. We have this the archangel Michael. We understand that as being Jesus. They thought he was unequal to them. So there's this idea we can see here of God being equal with his subjects, not ruling over. And we also see, what about the foot washing at the Last Supper? What does that teach us about God's kingdom?
Humbleness.
Pardon me? Humbleness? Yes. But what does it teach us about how what the king, about the king? Because Christ was the king and he washed the
Like he served.
disciples.
It's like God's kingdom is serving the people.
Right. So the king, he doesn't rule over the people and the people serve him. It's the other way around. He humbles himself and he serves the people. So there isn't this idea of rulership over his people. He's unequal and he doesn't rule over. He rules as an equal and he serves. So can we relate this structure to the United States government? Does anybody see that connection with, let me just give a hint of what I'm looking at or for. I'll say representatives.
Right. The government is, their purpose is to represent the people. It's not to represent their own personal beliefs.
Right. They'll elect a person from a group of equals, a group of equals, will elect someone to go and represent them. And he won't go and rule over those people. It's his duty to serve those people's interests, to serve them. So we see the same sort of structure, I'll call it, of the government in both God's kingdom and in the structure of the United States, that there's no rulership or rulership of one over another that we do see in the King of the North and Satan's model. So what is another traditional way that we identify the King of the North, for example? We often say that there's a certain way we quite easily recognize, especially if we're talking about the papacy. Any takers? Anybody see?
Coercion?
Coercion, okay, yeah. Yeah, I see that they, they make people follow their beliefs. But that's not really what we're seeing in a lamb-like aspect. That is what I'm asking, but we're also looking at, I'll just say it, it's easier.
I say
The
we
tribe
apply the law that is as it is written in the Constitution.
Identify, pardon? Sorry, you said, I think that Katya saying something about the Constitution.
Yes, sorry, I was saying that what makes it like a lamb is also to be able to apply the law or as it is written in the Constitution.
Right. Yes,
Or
definitely.
interpret the law.
Yes, but we also see part of what has made me start thinking about this is that Elder Parminder said there's not going to be a law exactly. So, but I can definitely see the connection to law, definitely the Constitution and law for sure. But I'm going to say church and state. That's another way that we can really identify the King of the North and how it's different from the kingdom of God. And we see in the United States as a lamb-like beast, the separation of church and state. So we have church, and if it's separated from state, then you can say that the church is not over the state. And you can also say that the state is not over the church because they're separate. They can't rule over the other. So there's no, so they're in balance, as it were. And I would say that this is reflective of God's kingdom, where church and state are together in a balance and not one over the other. Whereas we see the King of the North has church over state, and the King of the South has state over church. So we can see that this aspect as well. And as Katya was saying about the laws that have been put in place, when Elder Tess started talking about this freedom and equality, my mind immediately leaped to the laws that have been enacted in the United States. This idea that these laws have what's been enacted. So we see, for example, the end of slavery. We see the women's right to vote. We also see the civil rights laws. We see all of these laws that recognize equality over freedom. And this is lamb-like, I would suggest. So I would say, as a lamb-like beast, the US does not have a perverted sense of freedom. That it has the right idea, that the Constitution has been interpreted correctly with equality over freedom. So I want to take a moment and sort of look at this from a little bit different angle. And I want to say, at the last camp meeting, Elder Parminder took a closer look at the King of the South, at Russia. And he showed part of an interview with a Russian academic. I hope most of you or all of you remember that. And this academic talked about truth, and that he said that your perspective determines your truth. But what he said that really made a connection for me, sort of wasn't anything to do with that. What he made a connection for me was that he said Putin and Russia are trying to protect their way of life, and that they feel that the US is a threat to this way of life. And for me, this connected to absolutely everything. It just, a light went off in my head, and it connected to everything. Dominionism, they see a threat to their way of life, and so they mobilize against that threat. The moral majority, they see a threat to their way of life, and they mobilize. The South in the Civil War saw a threat to their way of life, and so they mobilized. Conservatives, basically, they try to conserve their way of life, and we see it everywhere, all through this. This seems to be the motive for so much, and we're going to see how this idea connects. So I want to ask a question about what is the opposite of conservatism, being conservative. What is that opposite of that? And I'm looking for something in particular, but I'd like to hear what your thoughts are. So what is the opposite to conservatism or conservativeness?
Progression.
Perfect. That's exactly what I was looking at. Progressive, being progressive. And I want to say that progressives, what they're not trying to stay where they are. They're looking to keep progressing to a better way of life. And that's the difference that you can see between conservatives and progressives. Conservatives want to maintain or keep or conserve their way of life, and progressives want to progress towards a better way of life. And I can say that that's what we are. We're progressives. We should be. As God's people, we want to progress towards the image of God. We don't want to stay where we are. We need to keep progressing, or else we would never reach that image that we're trying to achieve. So realistically, we can't be conservatives. So when Elder Tess is talking about how the movement needed to shift from being right-wing to left-wing, we needed to shift from conservative to progressive. It's required. We have to keep progressing towards that image. We have to be progressive, or be the opposite of trying to stay right where we are. And I also see this as a bit of a little bit, or connected to the Laodicean condition. The idea that we're blind to the sin in our lives, and so we're content to stay where we are, and we're not progressing forward. And this ties to the idea of the image of what Elder Tess has been presenting, the idea of the right wing being right, and that we need to move to the left. So I could see when she brought up this idea of equality, that we need, when freedom and equality come into conflict, that equality needs to win. it definitely connected to all of those laws that have been put in place that have been progressive rather than conservative, that have, so this lamb-like character, this progressive character, this continual movement towards the right way of doing things, or righteousness, let's say, of getting rid of slavery and giving women right to vote, and civil laws have all been a progress towards equality. And I would suggest that this does reflect God's kingdom. And I see that these laws have been bringing the country closer to reflect God's kingdom. However, as Elder Parminder said, we have to understand that maybe there's not going to be a definitive law that will be against equality. And Elder Test has been suggesting that this reality that we're going to be going through, or that we're in, it's so much more complex than the simple parables that we have, that we've been trying to understand through this time period through. So this idea of complexity, and I'm going to speculate because I think, just because I'm not positive, that the Sunday law will be more of a stop in the progress, or towards a better way of living, or a reversal. Like we saw in the Fugitive Slave Act, this was a law, which we're not necessarily going to see a law like it, but it was a law that took the country backwards. It was it stopped the progress towards equality that the founders of the Constitution had sort of written in, that there would be this progress towards equality and the end of slavery. But we saw the Fugitive Slave Act as a reversal of this movement toward, or progress towards, equality. So
Regression.
what? Yeah.
Regression.
Regression. Yes.
Going backwards.
Exactly. So when we see Roe versus Wade under attack, and if this is overturned, this isn't exactly a law from the legislature assembly of the United States, but it is taking the country backwards away from equality, a regression, as it were. So it has the same effect as a law in the legislature against equality. And so, is this what speaking like a dragon looks like? These are some of the things that we need to look at, these more complex things, this idea of character. And something else that comes to mind, as I mentioned earlier about Elder Parminder showed that interview with the Russian academic, and he made the point that Russia is just trying to protect their way of life. And he also made the point that what Russia wanted to see was a multinational world governance. He doesn't, and what did George Bush Sr. state would be the new world order? Does anyone recall that from what we've been learning?
Could you repeat the question?
Pardon me?
Could you repeat the question?
Sure. So we see that that this Russian made the point that Russia wanted to see a multinational world governance like the United Nations. And what did George Bush Sr. state as the New World Order? He made a comment in a speech about the New World Order. Was it a multinational world governance or something else?
No, it was unilateral. He saw that the United Nations was a good thing, but under the leadership of the United States.
Right. So he's basically, what he's saying is that he wanted a unilateral world governance, and the US would be king of the world. There would be he phrased it as the police of the world, but it would be under their direction. And so whose model is this form of governance, where you have rulership of one over another?
King of the North.
King of the North, Satan's model. It's not
Quite
lamb-like.
easy.
Pardon? Pardon? I missed that last comment. So is this what George Bush Sr. said, this unilateral aspect? Is this speaking like a dragon? Is this the more complex look at what speaking like a dragon, or the image of the beast is? So does Russia have a valid reason for feeling a threat to their way of life? I know that Putin, it's been a lot of propaganda that he's been feeding the people of Russia. But does his propaganda have a basis in truth? Should the people of Russia fear the United States or NATO or the rest of the world, that they want to take away their way of life? What do you guys think?
Quick answer would be yes.
Yeah.
But again, as you said earlier, Murray, it's more complex than that, in that state over church is probably what Putin's model, as Elder Tess drew the globe and the two poles, and they're polar opposites, but they're also very similar. It's just, in a sense, they're opposites, because state over church or church over state.
Right.
Pick your ditch that you want to fall into. Neither are right. As you said at the beginning, God's kingdom is in balance. And initially, the United States, the lamb-like beast, the aspects that are correct is there is no one over the other. It is God's principles of equality, and nobody has authority over another. But Putin, yes, there's a basis of truth. Even some of the NATO developments over time, in a sense, the US broke a promise, an agreement, and they were expanding, quote unquote, eastward towards Russia a little, and now with Finland and Sweden, wanting to join NATO. And I mean, you could see how certainly the tiger gets boxed into the corner and it gets far more fierce. Yes,
definitely. So I think that Russia does have a valid feeling, and we know that what's going to happen to Russia. They're going to be defeated by the King of the North. So their way of life is going to be destroyed by the United States. We know this is going to happen. We see it's already started. This information war, this idea. So I think the threat is real, and I want to take a moment to discuss an aspect of how this all started. This fight between the King of the North and the King of the South, and looking at this, the way it started we can see this aspect more clearly, I think. So after World War II, Russia, or during World War II, Russia took a tremendous beating. And what after the war, what did they do to protect themselves? Thinking about Russia after World War II, what happened where they became the Soviet Union? So what did that entail?
One word would be culture. They gathered territories together with Russian speaking, Russian lifestyle, and sort of made this historical, this is the Russian Federation, Union of Soviet Socialist Federation, unified ethic.
Right. What they were really trying to achieve, though, was to create a buffer between them and the West, to protect themselves, to protect their way of life. So they annexed these countries to create a buffer zone, as it were. So they'd have to come through all of these other countries to get to Russia if they wanted to take Russia out. So we see, and they became the Soviet Union, a union of these, and they basically put dictators in these countries and governed them all under the same roof from the Kremlin. So the important question I want to ask is, how did the US view this annexing of countries to protect itself? That's what Russia was doing. But how did the United States view it? This is in the 1950s.
Maybe as a potential threat against their way of life.
Exactly. I think you hit it on the head there. Russia became the threat, and the threat to their way of life. And they saw it was communism that was the threat, specifically a threat to freedom, because communism is equality, I would say, at the expense of all freedom. It's like we see church over state and state over church. In communism, we see that they talk about atheism, which is the ultimate of state over church. We also see that communism is really equality at the expense of all freedom as well. So we see this aspect of opposites as well, whereas the United States started at that point to really focus on freedom, because they felt that this is the threat from communism and Russia. And so I want to try, I'm just going to read something about McCarthyism. And McCarthyism, well, I'll read you a definition so you'll understand. McCarthyism is, in the early 1950s, American leaders repeatedly told the public that they should be fearful of the subversive communist influence in their lives. Communists could be lurking anywhere, using their positions as school teachers, college professors, labor organizers, artists, or journalists to aid the program of world communist domination. This propaganda about the internal communist threat, what we call the Red Scare, reached a fevered pitch between 1950 and 1954, when Senator Joe McCarthy of Wisconsin, a right-wing Republican, launched a series of highly publicized probes into alleged communist penetration of the State Department, the White House, the Treasury, and even the US Army during Eisenhower's first 2 years in office. McCarthy's shrieking denunciations and fear-mongering created a climate of fear and suspicion across the country. No one dared tangle with McCarthy for fear of being labeled disloyal. So it was, I think, this idea of Russia annexing countries to create a buffer to protect its way of life. The United States viewed this as a threat to freedom, and they magnified or started to focus on freedom and looked for communists everywhere. And I think this is where the start of this speaking like a dragon, this putting freedom over equality started, this focus on freedom started at this point. And so I want to ask the question, why did Russia invade the Ukraine? And I'll say, they're trying to create a buffer between themselves and NATO to protect their way of life. Putin is saying it was NATO and the United States that forced them to invade the Ukraine, that they had no choice. This is their argument, their truth. This is what the academic was saying. And so what is the Ukraine fighting for? They're fighting for their freedom. And so how does the United States view the invasion of the Ukraine? As an attack on freedom. And I'm not sure exactly how this fits, but I'm gonna put it out there, and maybe we can have a little discussion about this. But this is the aspect of Donald Trump becoming a dictator. This is rulership, pardon me, over the people serving the dictator, and this is not lamb-like, not like the kingdom of God. This is Satan's model of governance. So does this fit now that he's out of office, this idea of dictatorship, at least at the time being? And I recall how Trump's actions when he was in office, they showed how much power the president actually had. And it seemed to show the vulnerability of the checks and balances that were supposed to be in place to prevent this president from having kingly powers. So, so we can see this idea of dictatorship coming with Trump, and this this idea of an attack on freedom, that freedom is the focus of the people. What about this idea of dictatorship? Can we still see this? Is this going to still come about? What are some of your thoughts?
When I think about Trump's dictatorship, it basically encompassed 3 branches of government. So the dictatorship was like a complete executive, judicial, and legislative majority for the conservative Republicans. Right now you still have, so right now you only have a judicial majority for conservatives. Legislative is majority for the Democrats by 1.
Yeah.
Until midterms, and executive is obviously a Democratic president. So looking back on Trump and the dictatorship, it wasn't necessarily all about Trump. Trump may never even come back again. I mean, I don't know what's going to happen at the next election. Anything could happen.
It can.
While he was a dictator, it was encompassing the 3 branches of government. So it was a full authority over all branches.
Yes, and in what he did to the judiciary is he put that in place for basically all time. Well, not all time, but well, for the rest of time, I would say that there's not going to be a balance there. And that's an important aspect, especially when we see maybe the overturn of legislation that protects equality. So we see this idea of dictatorship existing. And again, that isn't a lamb-like structure. And we also see church over state. We want to look at that. And now Elder Tess has been presenting about the alt-right, about the Trinity. And she's saying that the church isn't leading the country from being lamb-like, that there's this other group, this Trinity, made up of the men's rights movement, libertarians, and atheists that are really the driving force behind this movement of the alt-right. And it's not so much church over state, this traditional idea that we've been looking at. So it's much more complex than what we originally wanted to see. And I made a connection regarding atheism. So there's just something that popped into my head and I wanted to share. And how, when they're talking about the alt-right and the atheists, they value logic and reasoning. And I remember back to atheism in the French Revolution and the idea, the goddess of reason, and this whole, seeing this idea of a revolution. And I can sort of start to see how this idea of a revolution fits. And with this Trinity leading this revolution against feminism, they're trying to conserve their way of life, and that is a misogynist way of life. This men's rights movement. It's a revolution, as it were, against feminism, against the progress that has been made towards equality. They're seeking to reverse this progress that we've been trying to attain to a better way of life, a life of equality. And we can see this revolution against women is a worldwide movement. There seems to be, I can see from some of the articles that we've been reading that there's this, especially Brazil and all of these areas where they're really pushing this misogynistic aspect. And so who's going to be with this Trinity, as it were, that are sort of leading this revolution in the United States? And we can say easily the conservative Protestants, the right-wing conservative religious evangelicals, they are going to be lockstep. They believe in headship, that aspect. So they're going to be in lockstep with them. And it's also, I would say, it's going to include Adventists for the same reasons. This conservative, trying to conserve their way of life, this headship aspect. The papacy, they believe in, the patriarchal system. This is same with, it's all connected, these ideas. They're all on the same page, this revolution against the progress. And so I'm starting to see that this is the more complex version of what the Sunday law will look like. It's not going to be a simple law that we can all see. It's going to be a much more complex, more about ideologies and principle that people are putting forward against going backwards, against equality and against feminism. So I can see that God, he lives by principle, and his government is based on principles. And so I can see the need that we need to identify these principles and see how they differ from the image of the beast, how the king of the north or Satan's principles differ from God's principles. And I think one of the fabulous tools that Elder Tess has brought to us is this idea of freedom and equality. It really enables us to drill down and see exactly which side of the issue we need to be on. The principle, these principles that lead to feminism, that lead to equality of the sexes. We need to understand these things, and I think this is a really important way of looking at the Sunday law through the lens of freedom and equality. And we can see that so much of the motivation is to protect a way of life. We see it on all sides of everything. And we see that the right side is to be progressive, to be progressing towards a better way of life, not keeping the same way of life. So we see this.
The correct side, Murray, might be wiser to say than the right side is progressive.
Correct. Okay.
So,
I stand corrected.
no pun intended.
Yes, I stand corrected. And we can see that there's many, many facets to the Sunday law. This character has many facets to it. And we are looking at the character of Satan against the character of Christ. And this is the complexity that that is going to be reflected in the Sunday law that we have to identify. And I think freedom and equality is a fabulous tool, absolutely powerful tool that helps us to identify the issues and the correct side of the issues for us. Does anybody have any comments about some of this idea of the complexity and about how freedom and equality fits?
It resonates, Marie, with me. I agree with everything that you've presented and so on. I mean, there will be, because of the complexity, there will probably be nuances that will yet be unveiled.
Mm-hmm.
But yes, and like you, I mean, this freedom versus equality, you know, when the tension exists, and doesn't mean freedom is wrong.
No.
It's just how, you know, what the context is and how it's used. And equality, when it clashes with freedom, equality having to be uppermost, equality, no pun intended again, trumps freedom.
Mm-hmm.
It has to be supreme. And that this is, you know, it's a subtle, like you're using the word complex as Elder Tess does too, but the subtlety, you know, many times principles, understanding principles can be very, very subtle in a sense. And that's it. I see this comparison and contrast, Satan's kingdom, God's kingdom. We can keep it at the simple level, but we also can go very deeply. And the subtleties are many times where people get lost in the reeds, so to speak. They end up not fully understanding, and they, in a sense, switch sides without them necessarily being aware that they've switched sides.
they might not recognize that they have. Um,
Yeah.
And I think, one of the things that I've also connected is the golden rule, or loving your neighbor as yourself. This connects with this idea of when you're looking at freedom and equality. This also is a tool to help us to see which side of the issue we need to be on. The golden rule. So you can see that if, for example, my closest neighbor is my wife, and if I were her, I would want equality. So it's easy to see on that level that I should, if I love my wife as my closest neighbor, as myself, I would have to be equal with her. I couldn't be anything other, because I know that that's what she would want. So this can help us. It all comes full circle. I see how it all comes together and connects, and it's so. I mean, I know that I'm only just starting to see the tip of how connected and that all of this is, and it just shows how the glory of God, and how he's leading me and leading all of us to help us to understand and make these connections, so that we can live by the proper principles and not inadvertently get on the wrong side. Anybody else have any suggestions or comments or anything that struck them when in this presentation? Or?
Well, I've been thinking about the complexity part, and this idea that Tess has touched on already, Elder Tess has touched on already, about equating atheism with the church, libertarianism with the state, and the men's rights, was it Men's Rights Association with feminism. Like, how does that, I'm curious to see how that's going to look when we consider church and state. Because we know that we're not dealing with the majority, we're not, as she said, the majority of people on the right are not
In the church.
Are not in the church, are not Christians. So we're dealing with something bigger than what we had initially thought it was. So when we're looking, we don't erase church and state. We just have to re-identify what the church is, because atheism is the church, right? It's the belief system.
Mm-hmm.
And the state aspect of that is this libertarianism, which is all about this absolute freedom, as opposed to Democrat and Republican. It just gets more and more complex. So it's constantly holding your breath for the next bit, to kind of see where it's going, because you're kind of getting it every step of the way, and it's such a slow process. But I'm almost hesitant to say anything to anybody, because I've been so wrong so many times in the past. Exactly. Where I feel like I'm just waiting now. I need to kind of see where this is going, because I've implied things that I thought were going the way I thought it was going to turn out to people before, and then I find myself having to kind of reel back from that and wait again to see, because I've been proven wrong.
Exactly. And with Elder Parminder's comment about there not being a law, it's really looking so different from what we thought it was going to look like, at least what I thought, what I was told. This is what exactly you're saying, that I've had to change. And I think that's what progressiveness is this idea of when you're presented with evidence, that you make a change towards a better way of life. But yeah, I see exactly what you're saying about how, it is, how much do you commit to saying, oh yeah, I think it's going to go this way, because you never know where it's going to change. Because I did not see this aspect of the libertarians and men's national or men's rights association and atheism. I didn't see any of that coming, and how it fits with that, and I didn't see the no law, as it were. I can see how it's all connected to law, and speaking of a nation is connected to their laws, but I'm starting, I think, to see how things are connected, and as these connections happen, I think it does paint a particular picture for us. Anybody else have any ideas or thoughts? Anybody have any ideas or thoughts about this idea of how the United States started focusing on freedom? I mean, I suggested it goes back to this scare of communism, and it brought freedom to the forefront and the focus, and it's been growing as a movement, I guess you might say, and it's found in the Trinity, in each of them, this idea of freedom and this perverted aspect of freedom that Satan believes in. So, any thoughts on that? Do people agree that they can see that that's possibly where this focus on freedom is coming from?
I think that the 1950s in communism was an example of it, but you can also go all the way back to slavery, right? It was the Southern, they wanted the states, it was the states' rights issues, right?
Mhm.
And it was about the freedom for the South to have and do what they wanted in regards to slavery. So it's, I think that the communism was, when you look at, if you remember Elder Tess's study on the three movements of I guess the conservative right, and you had slavery in the 1800s, and then you had in the 1950s you had this issue with communism, and then in 1979 you had the beginning of the moral majority, and so on. It carried on into Trumpism. So it's an example, but you can go all the way back to the beginning, because you had these perceived threats that were viewed all along, even in 1888 being another history where a group of people who were holding the status quo, they felt a perceived threat.
I know, and she brought up about Barry Goldwater and the Republicans, and it was sort of under his influence that there's this change in the Republicans sort of took place. And I kind of see that Barry Goldwater in the early 60s, he got his influence probably, I'm suggesting, from this communist threat, this focus on freedom at that time. So it's more, I'm speaking not sort of generally, we can see it all the way back, but more of this modern aspect of what's changed the Republican Party, how they've sort of flipped sides. Part of that flipping, I think, she was quoting an article that the writer suggested it went back to Barry Goldwater in the Republican Party, this flip. And and I was seeing that he probably got it from this communist threat to freedom, and the focus on freedom that's where he sort of developed it, and it sort of has snowballed to this modern aspect to the Republican Party can kind of come out of that. But like you said, you can see it all the way back.
Mm-hmm. I wonder, if you go back to the history of 1798, like you're talking about the king of the South, if I might be wrong on this, but the king of the South in the 1950s would have been the USSR. It would have been, because of the Cold War in 1989. So the king of the South at that time, that was the issue that the king of the North and the king of the South were dealing with, was this idea of communism versus democracy, essentially. But if you go back to 1798, the king of the South was France. And so then you have the United States being the king of the North. Oh, I don't know if I can say that. Can I? Were they the king of the North back then? I know the papacy was. Until
Yeah,
1798.
I guess when France was the king of the South, there would still be the papacy sort of until they were killed by France.
Right. And then at some point there would be a new king of the North, because I know by the time you get to World War I and II, you have Germany. But before that, I don't know if we can say the United States, but I guess the point I was trying to make is that the king of the South was proposing something different in 1950 to what the king of the North was. Two different ways of life, right?
Yeah,
So if you go back, France and the French Revolution and secularism was a fear of these Christians in America at that time, right? They knew that they came out of these dark ages. They came out of this dominance by government against people of their beliefs, their faith and their beliefs, and they saw France as a threat. This idea of what went on there as a threat. So, you know, in the period of the 1800s, they're kind of dealing with the same issue, this different ideology that comes from the king of the South,
right.
right? And so they feel a threat from that, and they need to in turn mobilize and do something polar opposite, you know, like do the complete opposite, or not do the complete opposite, but go full on an extreme into protectionism,
Yeah,
rather than recognizing any kind of harmony or equality that exists in between those things, those ideas of church and
yes.
state.
Recognizing that the other kingdom, as it were, has a right to follow its own course, as it were. But yeah, again, you're making connections, seeing how these things are all interconnected, forward and backward in history, and how things repeat. We see them over and over again. It's just shows how, yeah, it puts so much more evidence for us, I think, seeing all these, making these connections. Anybody else have? Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Should have
Go
let you
ahead.
ask the question first.
I was just going to say, if
I-
there's any other comments or questions or remarks.
And I hear what Jonathan is saying and agree 100%, and the remarks you're making. I thought that in answer to your initial question that occurred to me was, I do believe the ideology of Christianity does weigh in. I mean, Jonathan mentioned 1798. I was thinking in terms of people fleeing from Europe, where they're not wanting a pope or a king, church and state. And as it was being lived out in Europe under the papacy and all of the various monarchies and etc. But and I think that ideology of freedom really had impetus as people came to a new land, quote unquote, the promised land. And I think that thread does run through quite far, actually, the idea of Christianity and basing it on it, thus saith the Lord. Apostate Protestantism, though it ended up being, but at the same time, this idea of individual freedom. And yes, very definitely, as we learned, with some of the articles that we've read in the past and so on, the threat of communism, the perceived threat on a variety of fronts, but certainly communism weighed in there. Segregation being reversed, was a very big perceived threat. And, you know, all of these different steps, as Jonathan very well, you know, traced out a moment back.
Mhm.
And I think the new phenomenon, which you've highlighted, Murray, is this shifting that, again, Elder Tess has helped us all to see and perceive, the shift with atheism and these men's rights groups and libertarianism, this Holy Trinity, in essence, driving things now, where we're in a post-Christian world, as Elder DeVoe was saying, and it's no longer the bubble of Protestant Christianity, evangelical right, that's driving. It's broadened immeasurably, and so it will be interesting to see as it unfolds further. You know, the King of the South, in a sense, as you pointed out. Oh, I put my notes away. You know, Protestantism, Adventism, Catholicism, in many respects, are all going to be in the same grouping, which again comes back to the mindset. You know, what is driving it, and where equality is not supreme. This freedom, push for individual freedoms, individual rights, and conserving beliefs, you know, whether based on the Bible or whether based on, this has been our worldview, you know, in Russia for decades and decades and decades, and so on, and just enforcing, you know, in essence, forcing, because that kingdom, you know, Satan's kingdom, it is going to be, in essence, using force. And I think we'll see that more as the King of the South dies, you know, quote unquote, air quotes. We will see that unfolding more and more. Anyway.
And what you were saying, it reminded me that that ideology that we're talking about, you can see it in a backlash against big government or the city. What I was talking about, those examples about you know, in Vancouver having single-use, going against single-use cups, and so that people are saying, oh, I'm tired of government forcing me to, you know, taking away my freedom and forcing me to, you know, not cut down trees, and I want to cut down some trees. This idea, this aspect, this ideology, as it were, backlash against equality, a vote for wanting freedom. And I can see it in friends and neighbors and conversations, just about the daily things of life, and that people really want freedom. It seems to be growing, or maybe it's not necessarily growing. It's just I'm so much more aware, which, you know, this is what all of these things are doing for us. They're bringing our awareness. We're able to see the world in a much different way than other people are seeing it. And I thank God for illuminating us and showing us, giving us His light on how to see the world, how the world truly is. So thank you very much for all your participation, and I hope that this discussion or thoughts have helped others to make connections, and I'm interested to hear how those other people, and I'm very interested to see how Elder Tess and Elder Parminder move forward with what the Sunday law is going to look like, the nature of the Sunday law, and the complexity, and how where it's going to come from, how we fit into it all. So to close today, I'd like to say a short prayer. Our Lord in heaven, I thank you so much for all that you do in our lives. I ask that you help each of us to be humble, to be patient as you roll out this message, roll out our understanding, help us to see what's going on. That we wait for you before jumping too far ahead. I thank you for helping us to see connections, helping us to see how histories are repeated, and how your character differs so greatly from the King of the North, from Satan's character. Helping us to see what character we need to develop in our lives. I ask that you be with us, support us, encourage us, strengthen us for what we must go through. Help us to be able to speak to others and be able to come up with arguments against what they're saying, to show them the truth. I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.